I'm going to get started. I hope that I am unmuted and people can hear me. Someone nod if you can hear me. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Shore, and I'm the Executive Director of Focus for Health. I'd like to thank you all for calling in today. I'm not going to take up too much time, but I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I would ask that everybody who's calling in, can they just drop their name and the name of their organization into the chat box? We'd like to know who we're talking to today. And I also want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring those. And we'd like to save the last 15, hi, Elisa. We're going to save the last 15 minutes for question and answer. The people on this call are the experts on human trafficking. I just want to say briefly why Focus for Health is here. Our founder, Barry Siegel, is very concerned about the mistreatment of children. And the reason we're doing this webinar today is to try to understand, why do people want to harm children? And why do we as a society continue to allow it to happen? So with no more on my end, I'd like to turn this over to the experts in this field. Sara Mahoney is the Focus for Health board member. She came to us very recently and has 20 years of experience in human trafficking. And our relationship with her was part of our inspiration for getting all of you guys here today to have this meeting. I can't do justice to her background and all of her experience. So I just want to say her most recent accomplishment was in 2019. She was appointed by the Florida Attorney General and serves as the vice chair to the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking, which is a direct service organization to fight the sex trafficking of children and women in the state of Florida. So with that very insufficient introduction, I would like to turn this over to Sara Mahoney.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you so much to Jen Shore, who's an unbelievable executive director and does incredible work with Focus for Health. So thank you so much. And thank you to you and Laura Rollins for really putting this all together here today. Before I begin, I have to give a heartfelt thank you to the amazing and wonderful Barry Siegel, to the Siegel family, and to the Focus for Health Foundation for really putting a spotlight on injustices that affect all of our qualities of life. Focus for Health Foundation is dedicated to fighting justice, equality, and wellness. And ending child sexual abuse, as Jen just mentioned, is just one of the vitally important issues that FFH is addressing and tackling in a very meaningful way. We are enormously fortunate that Barry and the Focus for Health Foundation are supporting important organizations around the US and in Canada that are fighting sex trafficking. And we're very fortunate today to have 3 of those organizations here on this panel to be part of this discussion. Now on to our panel discussion. The topic of sex trafficking is absolutely immense. We could talk about this for hours and hours and for days on end. There's a lot of amazing work being done in the areas of awareness, in the areas of education, in the areas of training, legislation, and law enforcement. But until we tackle the issue of demand, sex trafficking is never going to end. Supply is the answer to the demand problem. 4.8 million people are forced into sexual exploitation worldwide. 1 million of those are children. It is estimated that over 100,000 children are being sex trafficked in America today. And the average age of those children is 12 to 14 years old. We must end this heinous crime. We must end this demand. So let us begin. Let us begin with our panel. We have a really wonderful panel. Our first speaker today is John Long. John is from the U.S. Institute Against Human Trafficking. John, thank you so much for being here, and here is our question for you. As director of the only safe home in the United States for rescued boys from sex trafficking, what does demand look like from your perspective? What are you seeing? Who buys sex with children?
Well, thank you. We're happy to be here, and we are working with a population that is definitely underserved. And can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. We're working with a population that's definitely underserved, and our home was built out of that need. Our co-founder and founders kind of traveled around and were looking for resources dedicated to the minor male victim, and realized there were very limited resources. And so the house that the U.S. Institute Against Human Trafficking created was the Hero House, which is dedicated to serving 10 years old to 17-year-old biologically born males in the state of Florida. And so our boys come to us with a plethora of different stories. Not every story is the same. Boys are trafficked much different than girls are trafficked. And so the methods that they were brought into trafficking and the ways they were trafficked are much different. But the buyer is typically kind of that same buyer that we would see with the girls. Our typical buyer that have purchased sex with our boys is typically that kind of middle-aged man who is a professional, typically making a salary of somewhere $100,000 a year is kind of where they estimate the majority of the buyer being. And one of the things they really view is the buyer typically views painful sex as a victimless crime. And so our kids are vulnerable to this because they come from broken families, they come from broken situations, lack stability, lack support. And so these guys come in and they are willing to give these kids physically what they need. And so our kids are trafficked. Typically, they're trafficked by themselves via the internet, dating websites, gaming websites. And so again, the buyer really views these kids as victimless crime because the kid is a willing participant. And that's one of the biggest things that we struggle to fight is these kids are minors. They cannot consent to sex with an adult. They can't consent to do things for money. And so our boys that we come in contact with, they would even tell you that they're not victims of trafficking because they didn't know what trafficking was. And so when they come to us and we start to delve into their story and they share with us what they've been through and what they've done, it's at that moment that they realize that they were being trafficked because society doesn't typically let the boy be the victim and society doesn't allow the boy to cry out for help. And so we typically don't see as many boys being discovered or identified. And it's not because the boy is not out there. It's because we don't do a great job of identifying the boy. We don't allow the boy to be the victim. So that buyer is typically kind of the same. It's not somebody who wakes up in the morning and says, I want to pay to have sex with a kid. There's typically steps that happen to bring an individual to a place where they're willing to go pay to have sex with a 9-year-old boy at a hotel. And typically, there's an addiction to pornography. There's other things that play into to this guy's lifestyle that brings him to a place where he's willing to do these horrible things to these boys right in our backyard.
John, thank you so much. And we are going to have some questions for you at the end of our discussion here. Thank you so much for that presentation. A lot to talk about there. Our next panelist is Audrey Morrissey from My Life, My Choice. Audrey, thank you so much for being here. And here's our question for you. At this time in America, when so much attention is being paid to inequities inside the communities of color, what is your perspective on why minority women and children are at such high risk and are such a large percentage of trafficking victims?
Thank you. That's a great question. Good afternoon, everyone. When I read that, all I could think about when we talk about what's going on in our society, we have a lot of folks out there and organizations, pro sex workers who are talking about like a full decrim, meaning pimps won't be charged, buyers won't be charged, brothels will be legal, and instantly in that fight that I am so embedded in because it's so personal for me, I have to say, because I'm a survivor of the commercial sex industry. And every time I have those conversations, what comes up for me is, clearly all men don't buy sex, right? We do have a demand in this country for sex, absolutely. But when I think of a full full decrim, I then begin to think about the demand where it is now, right? If we look at it like this now, and if we have a full decrim, now we're talking, you probably can't even see. Huge, right? And you said it earlier, it was said earlier, if there's a demand, you have to find supply. And where does our supply come from? Our children. Exploiters are not, they're just going to try and fill the supply, the demand, period. And so they will use our girls and women of color. And I'll tell you why. one reason, right? We all know that they're living in poverty, right? A lot of them. They don't have a lot of choices, whether it's around education, jobs, housing. And I think of these, when I think of the folks who are like, yeah, let's do a full decrim, I think of like these privileged adult white women who actually have a choice. You know what I'm saying? So the folks that are pushing this, they don't have to be in the life, right? A lot of them have college educations. They can go on and do other things. And so for me, and it's personal on both ends, being in the life and being a woman of color, the girls, our brown girls, black and brown girls are going to be the target to fill this void. And they don't have a way out. They're already stuck in bad situations. I even think that with adult black and brown women, right? Where are their choices? And so they will be used and abused, right? Thrown to the side, and then let's grab some more black and brown children and throw them into this. So it's a really, it's really disturbing. And this is the population of young people that will be hit the hardest, will be girls of color.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. And we're going to have some questions for you once we go through our panel. Thank you for that. Our next panelist is Cheryl Perera from OneChild. Cheryl, thank you so much for being here. And here's our question for you. There's a lot of discussion about the cultural mindset in our society and its contribution to the demand for buying sex with children. We see imagery upon imagery of children portrayed in a provocative and sexual manner, not to mention the latest controversy that we've all certainly seen and read an awful lot about. It's the Cuties movie on Netflix, where 11-year-old girls are shown on screen in a sexually explicit manner. How do you believe we can change this conversation, and what can we do about that?
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Sara. This is also a great question. I think we can change this through raising awareness, public awareness, and education. The general public can't always connect the dots. We need to help them do that. We need to help them understand how harmful cultural norms and attitudes that sexualize, that objectify, and dehumanize females perpetuates the demand for young girls. We need to help men and boys understand how culture, thanks to the media, glorifies his commercial sex. To the point where they've carefully curated this picture of the lifestyle of strippers and sex workers as glamorous, but then they fail to kind of show the other side, which is the violence, the disease, and the drugs that often come with it. This leads to a dangerous attitude among perpetrators that girls and boys in the sex trade do it because they like it, because it's easy money, and no one is forcing them to do it. We also need to educate the public around harmful norms around masculinity that kind of glorify male sexual prowess and accomplishment. We know that in many cultures, including ours, men are faced with peer pressure to attend strip clubs or to be with a sex worker because it's considered almost an initiation to manhood. We also need to raise awareness of the power imbalances and the social and cultural devaluation of children, which kind of leads to attitudes like the girl is, for instance, no longer a child. When she's a teenager, she's not considered a child. We also need to educate society about how the media has done, as you say, an incredible job in normalizing the use of children in sexually themed entertainment, and constantly bombarding children with sexual imagery. So like it or not, children's worldviews, their aspirations, their behaviors are being increasingly shaped by the media. So I think one way to kind of change this situation or this conversation is to work with boys before they become men who purchase sex with children. We know that boys as young as 11 are purchasing sex from their peers. So at OneChild, where I work, we run a speaking tour in schools that's led by a young male speaker. And what he does is he speaks to boys in the audience. So he talks to them about harmful social norms around masculinity and the hypersexualization and objectification of girls, and the media's role in perpetuating this. We also talk to them about gender-based violence and sexism. We rather than blaming, blaming and shaming, we invite them to become allies instead, and give them tangible ways that they can take action in their own lives, their own personal lives, in their schools and their communities to kind of change these norms. So, I've seen examples, so I'm based in Canada, and I've seen examples from other organizations in the US who are doing similar work, but they're doing it through workshops. And I think this is fantastic. I think using positive male role models to kind of shape positive norms around masculinity is a way that we instill values that respect human rights and dignity for an entire new generation of men. So, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Love that you're doing that. Love that you're doing that training and that level of speaking to the community. It's so important. We're gonna have some questions for you in a moment as well. And now we're on to our fourth speaker, Corporal Alan Wilkett. Thank you so much for being here, sir. We appreciate your time. Here is our question for you. You're retired from law enforcement for 30 years, and you headed up the Human Trafficking Division of the Pasco County Sheriff's Office in Florida for about 10 years. From the law enforcement perspective, what is driving the increase in demand, and what can be done to deter and dissuade sex buyers?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sara, for that question. And first of all, let me just say to everybody that's on the line, thank you for being here. It's a tough subject, but it's a subject we have to embrace. We have to talk about it. So let's talk about sex trafficking, human trafficking generally, because my friend John talks about boys being trafficked, and that's often something that's not very well understood, is that trafficking goes across the broad spectrum. We have women who are pimps or traffickers. We have men who are traffickers. We have boys that are trafficked. We have girls, men and women. So every demographic is subject to being trafficked. And I think that's an important point for everybody to understand, is that trafficking does not exclude any demographic, doesn't exclude any gender. However, the vast majority of sex trafficking is men buying, and women and girls are the ones who've been victimized. It's the vast majority. So we have to look at that and say, why is that happening? And what are some of the causes to this drive in demand? Why is demand so high? I think first of all, we have to look at the fact that most men don't buy sex. According to most studies, about 20% of men will buy sex at least once in their lifetime. That is atrocious. It's just horrible to think that 20.6% of all men will buy sex at least one time in their lifetime. And then when you also consider that of that 20.6%, that a small percentage of them become what's known as high frequency buyers. What's a high frequency buyer? A high frequency buyer is someone who buys sex weekly or monthly, and 25% of the high frequency buyers drive 75% of the market. I think about that for a minute, for everybody who's thinking about this. We have about 6% of the frequency buyers who are putting about 75% of the money into the market, which is what drives that demand. So we have to think to ourselves, why is that happening? Why is that demand there? And why does this continue to happen? So we have to look at what is known in my world as accelerators. Accelerators are things that take what could be a thought and accelerate it to an action. And when we look at accelerators, there's a couple of things in all of the cases that I've ever worked. And I have worked and consulted and advised on well into the hundreds of sex trafficking cases. And the majority of the cases that I have ever worked or consulted on has been what we call DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking. We are rescuing our own kids out of this market driven by demand. And so we have to look at this human trafficking triangle. It takes three things to make a human trafficking case. You have to have a victim, you have to have a trafficker, and you have to have a buyer. And the one that we can impact the most to stop this is not just to the supply side, but we have to get at the demand side and go after the buyer. So what's driving it? All the cases I've ever worked, the studies that I have read, there are things known as accelerators, and the number one accelerator in every case that I have ever worked. And I've got friends and colleagues who may have a case here or there but every case that I've ever worked, pornography was the number one driver. It was the feeder band that drove this demand side. Pornography, followed closely by drugs. So two cohabiting activities in every single sex trafficking case that I've ever made was, number one, pornography was always involved. And it was involved in two things, both to the buyer, to ramp them up, to look for activities that they fantasized about, to try out, for lack of a better term, to try out on that next victim. Let me see something else, a new thing that I can try. But the other thing that pornography was used for was for the victims, sometimes as young as 10, 11, 12 years old. An 8-year-old girl that I had an opportunity to help rescue was shown pornography to teach them what to expect. So pornography has always been a driver, along with drug addictions, substance abuse issues, and then there were other things that led to those exploitation of vulnerabilities. But think about demand-driven, those feeder bands and accelerators of both pornography and drug abuse.
Thank you, Corporal Wilkett. I think we're going to move on to some questions right now, and I think I might even just start with you, Corporal Wilkett, just as we're on this topic of pornography. One of the things that it's a very difficult topic to talk about, pornography, and legislators don't really want to go anywhere near this topic. A lot of people say, well, it's a moral issue. Well, no, it's actually a science issue, and there is data behind pornography driving demand. What do you see, and I'd be curious from other perspectives as well, on the issue of pornography? The access to pornography is just so great. And with the advent of technology, my son at 15 years old cannot buy spray paint at Home Depot because of the graffiti laws. But he could type something into his iPad and he can have pornography at the click of a button. And we know what this is doing to the young mind. We know what this is doing to men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and how it's feeding pornography addiction. So, Corporal, let me just ask you quickly, what can be done about this access to pornography?
Right. So the first thing that's got to happen is we got to involve the legal system. So our legislators have got to get engaged. And you made a powerful point that so many legislators don't even want to talk about this so I'm retired now, so I can say anything I want to. I don't have to, so it kind of liberates me to say some things. But there's not an appetite to really attack the demand side, because the truth of the matter is that those are two reasons. Those that are in positions to be able to pass laws so that we can enforce this are maybe culprits themselves, or there is this backlash from the pornography industry that hides underneath the First Amendment as though it's a right to just throw that out there for anyone to consume. And yet one of the largest markets for pornography right now are teenagers. And some of those, and if you look at some of the statements that are made from those who proliferate the pornography industry, some of the statements they're making is, we need to get t-shirts and we need to get advertisement into the hands of young teenagers so that market waits on us when they turn age. And we know that, so they're driving these new markets, and the markets that they're really going after are our teenagers. And so they'll use things, if we can put them in the military at 18, then why can't they consume pornography? But the goal is to drive that pornography consumption younger and younger and younger for conditioning and for the dollars that it generates. So we have to get the legislators involved. We have to start looking at pornography as a health issue and not just as a moral issue. Because as you said, the science and data is there that it rewires the brain and creates an unhealthy appetite when someone consumes this. And one of the biggest consumptions right now are men between the ages of 18 and 24. And it's estimated that 70% view pornography at least once a month in that age group. We have to get ahead of this and understand that it's not just a moral issue. It is an issue that is for the safety of our own kids.
Audrey, thank you, Corporal. Audrey, I'm seeing you nod your head, and I know that you feel strongly about this issue as well. And we can't talk about demand without talking about pornography. Would you like to make a few comments about that?
Yes, just a few. What I know on this end, and we're located in Massachusetts, my life, my choice. You know, and you talked about, Alan, that 18 to 20 something group, but I want to be real clear with people that our children are watching porn as young as 9. I remember a woman said to me in a training, she said, "Oh, no, not my son. I monitor all of his stuff." And I said to her, "Well, do you go to school with him?" I say that because I know when I was a kid, those of us of a certain age remember, what was it? National, why am I stuck on it? National
Lampoon, maybe?
No, no, it was a magazine. Anyway, we had National Geography magazine.
Oh, Geographic, National Geographic. Sure.
And I remember being a kid in school, right? And you would look through that magazine and you would see like African women's boobs, and you would pass that around the classroom, right? For all the kids to see. Well, now we have it in technology. And so our younger boys are being exposed to it earlier. And you said it, Alan, and right? And it's giving them a mindset. And I always look at it like this. Pornography it is raw, it is violence against women, it is horrible. And so when these young minds begin to look at this stuff over and over and over again, and they believe that's what sex is, and then they become old enough to have sex, and they try what they saw in the pornography on their partner, and their partner's like, "Whoa, what's up with that?" Right? But in their minds, there's something wrong with their partner, not me, right? And so I got to fulfill this need. And if my girlfriend or my wife won't fulfill it, then I can pay someone, right? Because they're going to make that fantasy that they saw happen in pornography, they're going to make that a reality for them sexually. And so that's where it fuels the demand again, right? Because buyers are being raised through pornography from a young age.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, John, you mentioned pornography as well. And, you know, having the boys in the home, and we know that the viewing of child pornography has never been greater than it is right now in our time in society. And John, is it something that you are seeing as well and hearing as well? We also know that so many trafficked children are in child pornography. What is your thought on that?
Absolutely. We know that survivors report, about 80% of survivors say that the person that paid to have sex with them showed them some kind of pornography to show them what they wanted to be acted out. And so our kids are, you know, they're all online, and we're even concerned during this time, during the COVID time, when our kids are spending even more time online. You know, they're at home, sometimes unsupervised, doing schoolwork, but then also being vulnerable to people online who are trying to groom them and trying to get to them. But our kids, you know, that they're oftentimes, we find that what's visualized in pornography eventually has to be actualized. And so they've watched it over and over and over again, and then they have to do it. And so that's what we see. People who are addicted to porn that pay for sex from kids have gotten to that point. And then our boys that are within our home, they've been exposed to pornography at a very, very young age. I would even contest that younger than 9 years old. They've been exposed over and over again. And so it's normalized some of the activities. And so when they're asked, you know, here's $50 if you do this, in their mind, it's already normal because that's what they've been conditioned to believe. And so porn is not only driving the demand, but it's also making the supply even that more vulnerable.
And Cheryl, you mentioned pornography as well. And is this something that you talk about when you do your trainings and when you speak to various groups in the community? Since it is such a difficult topic to talk about, is this something that you talk about as well?
Yes, absolutely. We talk about pornography in general, but we also talk to young boys about things like healthy relationships, about violence prevention. We explore with them, you know, perceptions of masculinity that's created by their peers in the media, and we help them to kind of build social norms that kind of emphasize social and personal responsibility for buying things like, or looking at things like, well, like pornography, and also kind of instilling respect and dignity for girls. So pornography is definitely one of the many things that we talk about in our presentations and our workshops that we do in schools.
Okay, yes, and this is it's an interesting time right now in America. This is such a conversation, even though this has been around for a very long time. We're in the era of Jeffrey Epstein right now, and there's all sorts of stories that we're hearing about and we're reading about, and I really think it's really very much on the front pages. Corporal Wilkett, I'll start with this question for you. There's a very controversial bill that was passed in California. I'm not sure if everybody here is aware of that bill or not. It basically allows minors to consent to various sex acts with a person 10 years their senior. And what deeply concerns me about this legislation is how it's going to affect law enforcement and how it's going to affect law enforcement to protect minors. Corporal, can you speak about this bill a little bit?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that this is a California bill, obviously, and was signed into law by the governor there, that basically allows the judge some discretion to not put the registry requirement on someone who's had, as they call it, consensual sex as young as the age of 14, as long as the perpetrator is not more than 10 years older. So let's look at the extremes for a moment. That means that a 24-year-old, an adult, can have, as they called it, consensual sex with a 14-year-old and not be put on a registry, a criminal registry, a sex offender registry, or a sexual predator. Again, 24, having sex with a 14-year-old, and the discretion is there now for the judge not to put them on the registry. This is one of the most asinine things that I have ever seen be passed in America. When we understand the predatory nature of those who are seeking out kids. Now, first of all, and even according to the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that if you're under the age of 18, if there's any commercial thing attached to that sexual act, it's a human trafficking case. So my first thought went to what happens to the sex trafficking or human trafficking case if there's anything of value that's attached to that, whether it be money, whether it be a gift, whatever that may be. If there's a commercial aspect, it should be a sex trafficking. So for law enforcement, now comes this confusion. You want us to enforce the TVPA and the human trafficking laws of our state, but now you're telling us that if it's quote unquote consensual, how can it be consensual with a 14-year-old? We've been down this road before. We've looked at this as a society and said, that's not acceptable for that age of consent to be there. But now you have that age of consent, 14, as long as they're no older than 24, it makes absolutely no sense. And what it does is it absolutely victimizes our children, who we all recognize are not capable yet of making those kinds of life decisions. And yet now they're held as prey to a predator as long as they're not over the age of 24. It's the most asinine thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's deeply hard to get my arms around. And I think for any of us, and I've tried to read it from both sides, I can't imagine that a legislator would actually work and put their name on this legislation. And I understand that the governor would not take any questions on it after he signed it into law. I think we're going to all hear a lot more about this. And John, just on this bill, you talk about the boys that come into the safe home, and quite often, like many of the minors that are sex trafficked, many times they believe that their trafficker or their pimp is their daddy and that they love them. And that, so how I can, when you think about what this bill would mean for trying to rescue boys, and then when you're trying to prosecute the trafficker, they're saying it's consensual. I mean, that's what California is saying. So how do you think this would affect particularly boys that are trafficked in America as well?
It's hard enough for boys to come out as a victim and have people believe them. And now we're going to say, well, you're not a victim because he's only 9 years older than you. And so you've consented to this. And we know that the number one thing that gets people out of paying for sex is the threat of going to jail or the threat of a criminal charge. And so if we start getting rid of those kind of things, then the demand goes up, more people are willing to buy because the risk is lower, and it puts our kids at a greater risk to be purchased.
Yeah. Audrey, do you want to say anything about that legislation? I could see you over there looking upset by
Yeah,
this.
I'm just very disturbed, and I was just like taking notes, and can't even imagine anything like that happening in Massachusetts. And Alan, I'm like you, I'm like taken aback. Like, how could a government official in a role like that, right? If you don't stand for anything, you should, in our society, stand up for our children, right? Our children are people who don't have a voice. They don't have a vote. They don't have a voice. And it's our responsibility to be the voice for young people. So I really find it disturbing. Like, after this, I'm going to research it because I hadn't heard anything about it. And it reminds me, a survivor called me yesterday in a meeting, another task force that I sit on. I missed the meeting a couple of days ago, but a survivor called me very upset. One of her staff was at the meeting, and I guess some other guy is out there doing presentations and saying that calling exploitation, like kids who are in the life, self-harm. And so, like, I've just heard two disturbing things back to back that make absolutely no sense to me. Mm-hmm. And like, when I heard this yesterday, it was at the end of the workday. And again, I'm a survivor. And so I have to approach things a little bit at a time because it's real personal for me. It's very, very personal for me. Mm-hmm. But this is really, really disturbing. Right. Very disturbing.
It's hard it's hard to get your arms around that. And Cheryl, in your perspective, you're based out of Canada. I believe it's Toronto, Ontario, where you were based out of. I'm not as familiar with the laws up in Canada, but when you see this law that was passed in California and how it's going to change the issue of demand, it's going to change the issue of prosecuting the demand. What do you think about that from your perspective up in Canada?
Well, I'm floored. We don't, fortunately, we don't have anything like this over here. But when I see this and I hear this, it just kind of fills me with anger. Oftentimes, you have, children, girls or boys who, we need to understand that in the case of anyone under 18, they do not have the capacity to consent. And the fact that I'm hearing that this is what it's all about, I think is just very, very, very dangerous, I think. So
yeah, very dangerous. I'm going to change gears a tiny bit. Corporal Wilkett, if we could just start talking a little bit about deterrence. And when you look at it from a law enforcement perspective, I know there are various things. Pasco County in the state of Florida is very forward thinking and has done some really interesting technology in fighting demand and in dissuading buyers, etc. What are some things you can tell us a little bit about as far as like reverse stings or other things that you think have been useful in fighting demand?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I think that reverse stings, using technology to our advantage, obviously those are things, but let me talk about a real example. So what we did is we got with our Board of County Commissioners, and what we did is we said we need to look at some ways to really kind of attack the demand side in Pasco County. And so we looked at some of those vulnerable places. Where are some of the places that this is happening? And we know it's happening, sex trafficking. So we looked at things like strip clubs, and we looked at, of course, known as street tracks and massage parlors, and some, especially the illicit massage businesses and things of that nature. And so a ordinance was passed that required the strip clubs, what we call our SOBs, or sexually oriented businesses, to put signage up that gave a trafficker the number to call if they felt like they were being trafficked or if somebody saw something. So they would put the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we required it to be in the lobby and in the dressing rooms and in the women's bathrooms, and now all bathrooms. It gave us the right to go in and inspect and make sure that those signs were in place. It gave law enforcement and code enforcement the right for a compliance check. During the course of one of those compliance checks, we walked in, and in the VIP room, we had the act of trafficking happening in the VIP room. Some would call it prostitution, But when you really begin to look at the story of the person who was being prostituted, they were actually being trafficked with their pimp setting out by the stage. Here she was in the back room having sex with a man. And of course, I arrested the man, or had our team to arrest the man, took him to jail. And the female began to talk to her, and her stage name was Skittles. And I thought about that, how demeaning just to be known as a piece of candy was what her stage name was. When I began to talk to her, she began to cry. And one of the things she made to me haunts me to this day. She looked at me and she said, "But nobody sees me." And it broke my heart. Here I am all geared up and in here doing my law enforcement responsibility. And I had to kind of turn away as the tears came to my eyes. My heart was broke because she said, "Nobody sees me." Well, when you heard her story, she was started in quote unquote the life at the age of 13. And here she was just coming out of her teenage years and just becoming in her early 20s, but nobody sees me. And I wonder how many of our kids are sitting at home and they have that same mentality, nobody sees me. And so if we're going to, first of all, we're going to get after the demand, we first of all got to start seeing those around us. We have to pay attention to what's going on and determine that we're going to take action, that we're going to make the call, that we're not become cops or not become law enforcement, but we're going to take that action. We got to see people. One of the studies that came out said, well, the number one deterrence was shaming, because the buyer was afraid that if they were quote unquote outed for what they were doing, they might lose their job, they would lose status in their community, there would be some public shaming that would come. That was one of the number one deterrents. One of the other deterrents was a length of jail sentences, because no longer should it be a misdemeanor. In my view, and this is going to be controversial, Sarah, so I'm going to go ahead and set the stage.
Bring it on.
It's going to be
Okay.
controversial. I think the buyer should be as equally culpable under the law as the trafficker, because the
Amen.
buyer is
Amen.
responsible for the trauma that's being inflicted on that victim. I think the buyer should have the same jail sentence, should have the same charge as what the trafficker does, and be held equally culpable under the law, because the length of jail sentence and the amount of fine was also a big deterrent in these same studies that said what would stop a man, in this case, a man, from buying sex. So I think we should bring the culpability back, raise it from a misdemeanor for buying into a felony, and let's go after these buyers and bring this demand down.
Fantastic. Audrey, would you like to piggyback on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
And what I find, and I'm just speaking on, like, you know, in the area of which I work, like typically like a profile of a buyer, and John, you kind of touched on that a little bit. But the bottom line, a lot of times, for it to be a multi-billion-dollar industry, people think it's the creepy guy in the trench coat that's buying, right? When in reality, like you said, John, our data show like they're making like 140,000 white male. And a lot of times, Alan, I don't know if you've witnessed this, but when stings are done and the buyer is this upper middle class white male, and the law enforcement in the sting are middle class white men. And let me tell you something, let me be real clear. I experienced this when I was in the life as a kid and as an adult. I've gotten busted in cars, and, you know, I'm before internet, right? But the bottom line, things were said right in front of me to that white male, like, what are you doing with her? Go home to your wife and family. And I was arrested, right? And so I feel that same privilege, and not because they're bad cops, that's not what I'm saying, but because it's coming from a place of, oh God, one of my peers is in this sting. What are you doing here? Get home to your wife. You know what I'm saying? And I think if we begin to arrest these privileged white men on a more aggressive level and charge them, we would get somewhere, because they still have privilege, right? And they don't, those high frequency buyers, some of them have been caught in stings, but it didn't stop them from buying, because a lot of them weren't arrested based on their white privilege. And so we have to look at that too when we're looking at the demand.
Yeah, no, I think we absolutely have to talk about that. And if we know through research, we know what deters buyers, what scares buyers, what we need legislators who are willing to back up this type of legislation. This is a very tough issue for a lot of legislators. It gets enormously controversial, but absolutely the idea that, buying sex is, a misdemeanor. Jumping the turnstile in the subway is a misdemeanor, right? So there's got to be teeth in these laws. Cheryl, if we can move to you a little bit, we talked a little bit, you did a little bit about the cultural conversation. So as it relates to law enforcement, a little bit about Audrey, what Audrey was just saying, how do we get males to be more part of the conversation? How do we change this conversation a little bit as it relates to law enforcement and to males who are buying sex?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need to kind of do a lot of myth busting and challenging some of those, those misconceptions and those stereotypes. We need to work with young boys to kind of understand, to understand the fact that these are actual people, these are actual girls who are being exploited. They're not just objects, they're not just sexualized objects. So we need to kind of work with them to understand, to kind of teach boys to kind of realize that this is actually really important. So I think some of the kind of the misconceptions that we kind of need to challenge with young boys is the notion that like boys will be boys, for instance, that purchasing sex is something like that's natural, like it's part of natural male behavior, and that it's part of their sexual instincts. So these are things that the kind of things that we need to kind of work with young boys right away.
Mm-hmm. And as we speak about young boys, John, it's always been really interesting to me that the only safe home in America for rescued boys from sex trafficking is in Florida. But we know that there are boys around the country. I think alone in the state of Florida, boys are 14 to 15% of the children that are trafficked, again, average age 12 to 14 years old. But I believe that number across America is upwards of 40%. And my question for you is, how does this work with, I know we've had there's been issues at the U.S. Institute with boys that have needed a place to go, and that state does not have the proper facility. Again, I'm going to bring up foster care with you all in a moment, and we all know so many of them are runaways from the foster care system, and many times they're put right back in the foster care system just to run away again and to just stay in that horrible cycle. With it being the only home in America for boys, how do other boys across the United States who are being trafficked who need that level of trauma care and that kind of care, can they get to your safe home, and what are you doing to sort of help protect other boys around the country?
Well, we know that nationally, somewhere between 100,000 and 300 kids are trafficked every year. And of that number, it's estimated somewhere between 36% and 50% are boys. The data is all over the place because boys are really hard to identify. Boys don't want to be identified. And also we're just doing a bad job of identifying them. And so the data is everywhere because we're not really sure what those numbers are, but we know that the boy victim is out there and he's underserved nationally. And so we're working with some other states on opening safe houses. Florida, it's around 14.5% of minors that are trafficked are boys. And so that's, somewhere around 100 kids just in the state of Florida that are trafficked. And we've only got 5 beds in the whole state of Florida to serve that 100 kids. And so one of the things we're dealing with is, the safe house isn't for everybody. If we can keep a kid in the community, somewhere with a family member that is safer, we want to keep that family structure together. But we also know a large percentage of these boys are going into the Department of Juvenile Justice system because they've committed some kind of crime, sometimes related to their trafficking. And because they're boys, we don't always delve into that story to figure out why did you do what you did. We just treat you like a criminal. And so a lot of them are going to the juvenile system. When a girl runs away and she comes back and her hair is done and she's got nails and she's got shoes, somebody typically will say, well, how did you survive like that? But when the boy runs away and he comes back 2 weeks later and it doesn't look like he was living on the street, nobody says, how did you live like that? It's just kind of welcome back. And we don't want to know, and we don't know to ask those questions. And so nationally, we're working to open up additional safe houses. We're also working on what is called an interstate compact, where if a kid is rescued in another state and there are no services available to that kid, that the state the kid is in has to fund to send that kid to a safe house. If it's a neighboring state, if it's Florida, then that state has to fund it, because it always comes down to a funding issue. We got a call from a youth in Missouri. It was a 9-year-old boy who had been trafficked by his family his whole entire life, started being sold for sex around 4 years old, and all his life was sold hundreds and hundreds of times. And so we got the call of this kid. We worked day and night trying to get this kid into our home in Florida. Florida was unable to fund the kid because it wasn't a Florida resident, and Missouri was unable to fund because the house was not in Missouri. And so this kid ended up kind of in a limbo. And while he was waiting, ended up in the Department of Juvenile Justice in Missouri. But so we are working diligently to make sure that those victims have services in their community, and if not, they have the resources to find those services and have those funds available. When a kid commits a crime and he needs to move from one state to the next, there's always available money. But when it's time to have a victim served, everyone's a little tighter with the money.
Right. Happy to move between juvenile justice and jails, but not for shelter. And we only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to, Corporal Wilkin, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, as we live in this age of technology, here we all sitting here in front of our screens, able to have this really important discussion. But as you look at technology and fighting demand, are there any sort of interesting or cutting edge pieces of technology that are being used to deter, again, to find buyers, again, the shaming, to deter them, to dissuade them, to let them know, I see you. I know we hear an awful lot about the stings, the various sting operations. I actually was good friends with the DA in New York many years ago. I'm talking 15 years ago. And she used to say that if she wished she had more money in her department, because she'd have a couple of detectives online and they were forever catching these pedophiles that were communicating with kids that they knew were of a certain age. So they were getting them all the time. So what are you seeing and what are you doing in the technology area to fight demand?
Yeah, so there are leaps and bounds. Of course, you would ask me a technological question.
Of course.
But there's a lot of things that are happening, and I think the stings that you talked about are really moving online, because that's where this is moving to. Some of the latest studies that we see is that all 4 stages of human trafficking are now moving online more than any other. In fact, some of the stats are 60% or more of both the recruiting, the grooming, and the buying is all happening online. So we know that we have an issue on the online technology side of this, because that's where it's moving. Somebody asked me the question the other day, said, why is it going online and not to playgrounds and bus stops? And it's still there. So we still have the street tracks and we still have the brothels. Those things are still in place. But what's happening is that predators want to go where the kids are. We used to really try to protect them against parks and the mall. We would warn our kids, when you go to the mall, stay together, because it was physical domains. Now it's a digital domain that the kids are in, and that's why the predators are there. So we've got to have technology that can help, and there are some out there. So there's some software that can be downloaded that helps protect against apps and things of that nature, but there's ways around every single one of those. So what we're looking for is creative ways that can enhance the power of law enforcement to get out on the internet, because when you start talking about dark web investigations and you start talking about those types of things, it requires a lot of technology getting there. And I will be honest with you, law enforcement has always operated 2 or 3 steps behind the perpetrators. And we have to change that culture and that mindset so that law enforcement is a step ahead and not always 2 or 3 steps behind. So there is some unique technology. One of the things that I put on the website for the sheriff's office back a year or so ago was the 21 apps that all parents need to be aware of. And so it's up there right now. And yet 2 months after we put the 21 apps, half of them's changed. Some of them went away, and now there's new ones there. And all of this is encrypted technology. It's so much more sophisticated than some of the tools that we're trying to use to detect it. And so we have to get to that mindset. This really is a digital domain, and we have to get there and interrupt and disrupt on that domain.
Audrey, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think about demand abolition, which since ran out of money, but they were located here in Boston. And I don't know if our law enforcement are still using the tools that were developed, but I know that they had volunteers, and they set up like these fake ads. And so when buyers would call in, right, they had other men talking to them or other messages sent to them to deter them from buying, you know, talking about the harms that it caused, you know, what if your wife found out, you know, like all these different things. And I don't know if our law enforcement is still implementing that, but I think law enforcement finding agencies that are focused on demand in their areas and setting up sites like that and finding ways to interfere and send messages to the buyers. You know what I mean? About it's not healthy to buy people. And one of the beliefs that they need to hear is that, and this is hurtful to them. They need to know that sexually exploited women don't enjoy the act. Like really, they don't even like you. You know what I'm saying? Like really getting those messages out to them. You know, and because their belief systems, a lot of these buyers believe prostitution reduces the likelihood of rape. You know, women and girls are objects. Sexually exploited women are lesser than others. We have to like they're people, because you can't buy someone if you really believe they're a person. That's pretty hard to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so they were having really good success with that, but you know, for some reason, you know, recession, I forgot what happened, but their funding ran out. But people can Google demand abolition. There's still probably some people that were involved to get information to figure out how to team up with law enforcement to set up some of that stuff. See if you can get some men who will volunteer their time once or twice a week and put those ads up, because we do have to get the message out to these buyers as well, right? Because they don't think they're doing anything wrong.
Right, and Cheryl, excuse me, I'm sorry, Cheryl, that is absolutely. And, you know, as we discuss technology and how it's driving the demand, and demand is using it, and as Corporal said, up to 70% are using internet now in order to buy, to find, all of that. What are you seeing in Canada? What do you see in Ontario as it relates to technology and sex trafficking?
I think we're seeing a lot of the same thing. You know, a lot of children are being recruited on social media, on dating sites, on various kinds of websites. And so I think what's really important, you know, in Canada, I think we focus so much on speaking to practitioners, which is extremely important, you know, the social workers, law enforcement. We haven't really spoken enough to kids. We haven't spoken to children and, you know, really focused on teaching them about cyber safety. So when we do our presentations, for instance, we go into schools and we teach kids about the luring and grooming process that comes with meeting individuals or traffickers or perpetrators online. We help kids really understand them. We tell them, you know, actual stories of children who have been lured online, and help them really understand it and kind of gauge that. So I think that's really important. Is we, you know, working on the technology, of course, but we also have to do the education and the empowerment of kids themselves, so that they can actually be empowered enough to kind of protect themselves and keep themselves safe.
Mm-hmm. And John, just lastly on this topic, as we discuss technology and the boys, and, you know, we know, particularly, you know, I know particularly, you know, having 3 sons, you know, the amount of time that is spent gaming, and the times that I'll say to my youngest son, who is that? Who are you talking to in there, right? So we know that there's just so much of that, that the boys maybe a little bit more so than the girls, because the girls don't necessarily game as much as I think they do more social media related things. Do you find in the world of treating boys that the online piece has been a huge part or a big part of how they've ended up in their situations, or not?
Absolutely. I would say that 99% of the kids that we come in contact, somehow technology is involved in their trafficking. Some of that, again, is just the dating websites. But as you mentioned, we had a victim within our home, a survivor who was groomed through online gaming and was gaming, and people were on there communicating with him and kind of groomed him through that process and showed him a lot of attention. And slowly through that relationship, they lured him into their home. This kid was sold for sex over and over again for years. And, Alan talks about, being able to see, we need to see these people. This kid lived in a trailer for a year who was sold for sex over and over again. And the neighbors didn't even know that there was a kid in that trailer. There was people that were shuffled in and out of that trailer all of that time. And nobody recognized the warning signs, the red flags. But all of that happened simply by innocently playing video games. And they found a kid who was vulnerable and were able to traffic him that way.
Wow. No, it's an interesting time with the advent of technology and the role that it has played. It used to just be more so a lot of, Backpage magazine and all of the various advertising that was done. And it's just technology has elevated this. I know that during COVID, we know that the reports of child abuse cases were down 75% because it's the teachers and the nurses and at school that will do the reporting. But we also heard that in that 3-month period, the online sexual exploitation cases had doubled. So we know what a role it played. And it's such a scary time during this COVID era, which we are hoping is coming to an end at some point in time, that the children are spending an enormous amount of time online. And it's a brave new world. It's scary, and everybody needs to be paying a lot of attention. We are at 3:02. We had promised to keep this to 1 hour. Like I said, we could talk about this forever. I'm going to wrap this up. We've got some questions from the audience, and if the panelists would just stay on for a few more minutes. But for everybody else who we had promised that we'd only keep you an hour, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this really important panel discussion. I cannot thank Focus for Health enough for their unbelievable interest and their efforts in ending child sex abuse, and for really, really keying in on a couple of these wonderful organizations that they're involved with to help fight sex trafficking. And there are a lot of wonderful articles that have been written on this topic, really well researched by the executive director, Jen Shore, as well as the team at Focus for Health. So I recommend going to their website. And I was also told to recommend going to endchildsexabuse.org for more information and for more articles. So now we are now into our post 15 minutes. So what I'd like to do is, as I wait for a couple of questions to come in from our audience, if I was to ask each one of you, okay, if you could write one piece of legislation that you could get passed as it relates to sex trafficking, what would that one topic be? Cheryl, I'm going to start with you this time. If you had one thing that has not been worked on, talked about, what would it be?
Yeah, I think, and it's actually we're seeing quite a bit of rallying about this, but it's not sex trafficking, completely focused, but it's related to pornography and the connection between the two. So one thing that people are really rallying for is age verification. Because we see on a lot of cases, like Pornhub, take for example, they're calling it Traffic Hub now. You have a lot of young girls who have been filmed or whose rape has been recorded and has found their videos up online and they can't take it down. And so we want to be able to have this kind of age verification in place. So I think that's something that we would really need, and that would certainly help the anti-trafficking cause.
Okay, great. Audrey, how about you? If you were there with the legislator and you said, this is my wish, this is what I want, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I got to say, Alan, you really moved me. One of the things now, that's really huge for me, from changing the demand from the charge, if they are arrested, from a misdemeanor to a felony. When you're dealing with children, would definitely be right up there. And the second thing for me is we cannot do a full decrim. I would want Nordic model, which is not arrest the women, not arrest the children, right? But continue to arrest buyers, traffickers, brothel owners. That would be that would be, before I heard what Alan said about that, that would have been my one. But that is something I'd like to see pushed. Alan, if you make that happen, follow up. I mean, I'd really support something like that.
Okay, Alan, on to you.
Well, I think it's already been said. In fact, it was just said. And that is, if I had one piece, and I would come straight after the buyer, and that is, if you're going to buy it, you're just as responsible as the trafficker for the trauma. So therefore, you're equally culpable. You will be charged the same. Same charge for the buyer as it is for the trafficker.
Love it. Love it. Okay, John, how about you?
I would do the same as Alan. Same exact thing.
So I think that there is absolutely this general feeling that, you know, as it relates to demand and as we go after the buyers, that they should be held as culpable as the traffickers and the pimps. And what we need is we need some very strong and tough legislators to sponsor this legislation. And we need a strong lobby for law enforcement. We need a strong lobby for our foundations and for organizations to say, this is what we're demanding. Like I said earlier, I think that there's a lot of incredible work being done for providing services and trauma care and safe homes and awareness and education and training. But it's absolutely imperative that we go after the buyer as harshly, because, you know, you've seen all these, there's been an awful lot of trafficking busts, and I watch everything, and I watch the press conferences, and I watch the sheriffs, and where's the buyer? Right? We're seeing the traffickers and the pimps. Okay, where's the buyer? So, okay, so we have a question here. Let me read that. So, okay, so here's the first question I have, and it's for Audrey about, and I have very dear friends who are survivors as well, and I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on this too. But how do you feel? What is the importance of survivor-led organizations and survivors in leadership positions within organizations?
Key factor. One thing I can shout out and brag about is My Life, My Choice. I think we employ more survivors than any other organization in the country. And of course, we're in the process of even revamping that and putting things in place for survivors to grow into more leadership positions. The other thing we offer at My Life, My Choice is a mentoring program, and it's where we pair adult women survivors with our adolescent youth for a one-on-one mentoring relationship. What's cooler than that? To have someone who's been through what you've been through, you can openly talk about, right? You can trust, and also I feel that we can say more to the kids than like a clinical person could say, right? Based on our experiences. The other thing at My Life, My Choice, we have a prevention curriculum, which we recommend. Yeah, anyone can run the groups, but we know the groups are more effective when the two people running it, one is a survivor, when you're doing this prevention work. And so you can't do this work without survivor leaders in place. You can't. And who is a better expert of exploitation than someone who has lived it? You can study it all day long. It is no comparison to the knowledge that I bring to the table as a survivor. You can't get that in a college classroom.
Absolutely.
And so it's vital, and real vital for our young people.
Absolutely. And I know just from working here in Florida, I know that there's a survivor leader who I'm a great admirer of, who played a major role in passing legislation in the state of Florida about the need for training hospitality workers. She had talked about her trauma as a young child as she was trafficked into a hotel, and you know, the bellman at the hotel would open the door throughout the day for this child that was there.
Me too.
So the importance of what to look for if you are at the front desk, if you are at a restaurant, if you are in a store and you see a child or a woman coming in, and all the signs to look for. And I agree with you, the importance of survivors being a huge part of this conversation. is imperative. Cheryl, is that your experience? I'm curious, I don't know as much about Canada law as I do about in the United States, but as far as, survivor leader informed legislation and training, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's something that we're seeing more and more of. There are a few organizations that are doing incredible work that are survivor-led and focus on survivor empowerment. For instance, there is one organization that has become a social enterprise that kind of provides jobs for survivors so that they can be peer educators, they can present to police, they can present to service providers. So we have that kind of thing happening, and I've seen it, across Canada. Echoing what Audrey said, survivors are the experts of their own experience. And so, for OneChild, for instance, even though we're not necessarily a survivor, I'm not a survivor, we do in our presentations, our prevention education presentations that we do in schools, we have survivors who come and they consult on the material that we're actually giving out to kids. So they're giving their ideas, telling us where, we might be more impactful, where we went wrong, that kind of thing in the development of our presentations, of our workshop materials as well.
Okay. One of our questions relates to large sporting events. And you often hear that large sporting events attract a lot of people who want to purchase sex with women and children. And we have had the Super Bowl here in Florida last year. We have another one happening this year in Tampa, but there have been large, the fights in, so many stories that came out of Las Vegas during the Merriweather and Pacquiao fight, and the stories that I'd heard that had come out of there. There is an awful lot of discussion of the Super Bowl this year, and the Super Bowl last year, which was in Miami, and it was supposed to be, the question was about the fact that there was a lot of conversation, because January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so there's a lot of conversation about the fighting of sex trafficking, and you had the Super Bowl, and there was all sorts of groups and organizations that, we'd heard an awful lot from. We'd heard law enforcement talk about quite a bit as well. And then there was this halftime show that was beautiful musician, artist, actress who did a whole piece on pole dancing and dressed up in a bondage kind of outfit. And there were children on the stage, and this was all very celebrated. And it really kind of was like, talk about a need for a change in the cultural conversation. And here there were all sorts of organizations that were fighting sex trafficking right outside the stadium and what is happening. Corporal Wilkett, you're based in Florida, and there's another Super Bowl that is coming to Florida this year. Can you just tell us real quick, we only have another couple minutes left, what are some of the things that law enforcement can do to fight demand around these large sporting events that are happening in our big cities across the country?
Yeah, so we're using some technology, as you're aware of, to map out high traffic corridors and vulnerable businesses to get eyes and ears trained. So we have trained observers that are giving those tips to law enforcement, so we can allocate resources to those places. So we're already in process of doing that now. So teaming up and partnering with the community and with great NGOs that are in the area so that we can get awareness and training, because law enforcement has a limited number of resources. So we need to get the resources where that activity is happening. It's amazing, Sara, that you mentioned Miami and what happened at the halftime show, because not a half mile or a mile from the stadium was what was being known as the stripper bowl. So you had the Super Bowl and the stripper bowl, and both activities were on a pole. So it really was one of those confusing messages where we're trying to fight trafficking. I don't think the Super Bowl is evil per se by any stretch of the imagination, but what happens is large crowds are gathered in, traffickers bring down their stables, the pimps have their stables there so that they can kind of take advantage of the party atmosphere. They push it out. So law enforcement has to know where those things are happening, get resources and manpower and allocations into those places, and using the partnerships with community, NGOs well ahead of the large scale event to make sure that we are there to disrupt and then dismantle trafficking organizations.
Oh, unbelievable. Guys, unfortunately it is 3:15 and we are out of time. I just want to let everybody know that this has been recorded and that it is going to be up on the Focus for Health website in the next couple of days. Again, thank you to these amazing panelists, Cheryl Perera from OneChild and Audrey Morrissey from My Life, My Choice, and John Long from the U.S. Institute Against Human Trafficking, and Corporal Wilkett, retired Pasco County Sheriff's Office. We appreciate your help so much in being part of this panel. We could do 10 of these panels. There's so much that we didn't get to today, and we might be tapping into all of you in the future to be a part of something with us again. I thank you again to Barry Siegel. I thank you again to Focus for Health Foundation for caring so deeply about so many important topics in the world right now, not just in the United States, and for supporting all these amazing organizations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for your time. Thank you, Jen.